All righty. So, what I'm really doing on these sessions, welcome to Strategic Planning Part 4. Uh, and we're starting out on 7.0 Internal Assessment Structure and Function. What I the format that I've been using is kind of talking through the questions and kind of talking through my take on them, kind of some of the things I've seen along the way, and if there's any tips and tricks along the way. Um, for both of you, if there's something that I say that's either fuzzy or that you want to add your own flavor to it, this is very much of a kind of a work in progress facilitation piece. It's not just a talking head session. So with that, so under 7.1, the first question is our organization effectively structured to respond to the current needs of our customers? And if not, what do we need to change? Kind of what prompted that question is the number of people over the years that I've talked with that are particularly, that tend to be on the sales side of the house. And the conversations with me have typically gone, oh my God, Doug, it's like, why do these guys keep putting one hoop in front of me after another, after another, after another? All I'm trying to do is bring in business. Why are they making it so hard? And so it tends to be because of the processes, and it can be everything from accounting processes, order entry processes, sales processes, credit app processes. Any of and all of those things can all be fair game that makes it hard for somebody to do business. But in addition to that, sometimes organizations will set up their organization structure in a way that's convenient for them to run the business, and they don't necessarily thinking about creating an organization structure for anybody who's trying to do business with them to make it as easy as possible. So sometimes when you get into this question and you start to ask that kind of that setup the same way I've just done it, even if people thought their first gut instinct was, well, sure, sometimes just by telling that war story gets them to kind of step back and take a fresh look at how they're doing what they're doing from an organizational structure perspective. The second question is, do we have measurements in place to know how well we're meeting those needs? And if not, what do we put in place? A lot of times people will start to think about kind of how, would you recommend us and so on, tend to be the questions that most people tend to think about. Are we easy to do business with? That's where most people end up kind of gravitating through. The net promoter score over the years has become more and more widely known, and this is where that tends to get introduced into the conversation. Do we have processes in place to quickly respond to customer input and or complaints? And a lot of times I'll use that as, even if they answer that question yes, I tend to probe it a little bit and say, talk to me about what those processes are. Because it's a lot of times where the magic happens is it's more than just a form for somebody to fill out. Because a lot of times some of the basics, almost like the equivalent of a complaint box, if you will, in the old days, might be there. But what I want to find out is what happens after somebody has filled in those forms. How long does it take to respond, or how should it? And is there a difference between customer input versus customer complaint? They don't necessarily have to be synonymous terms. the next question really does speak to the sales teams specifically. The second question of that group, though, is how could or should we better support our sales teams? Can oftentimes can lead to a very, very robust discussion. Um, what kinds of things could be in place that makes it easier for the salespeople to have the resources they need to get things done? And it can be everything from people that are basically working on sales proposals or crafting responses to RFPs, if that's kind of a big part of their industry, to searching out opportunities. Who does that? Is it purely being done by the sales group? Or in some cases, some organizations will structure that as part of kind of an initial foray by somebody within marketing that then goes back to, that then gets turned over to sales and then ultimately gets back, in terms of order processing and so on. The next question is, how easy is it to do business with us? And a lot of times on that one, I'll change the question to, if I accused you of being really easy to do business with, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Or if I hauled you into court and accused you of being easy to do business with, what would you present on your side that said, yep, that's in fact a true statement? Again, it gets people to kind of think about where could there be kind of flaws in the way of how they do things so that they're even more frictionless, if you will. There's a book that uses a phrase, oil on glass, in terms of how smooth things operate. And I think that's a very colorful phrase. Moving over onto page 30, to what degree does our rewards and recognition programs support our strategy and our values? This is almost a discipline in and of itself, so I'm typically not entering very deeply in this because it's not an area of my personal expertise. But one of the things that I will often get involved in terms of the discussion on this is making sure that what they want to be rewarded is really being rewarded and there's not some unintended consequences. And the story that I probably tell is I was working with an entrepreneurship and they had somebody who was really, really, really good in sales. And so they decided that they wanted this, that they were going to pay this person full commission, no salary. And all of a sudden, this person started to stopped showing up at their sales meetings. And so the company president was kind of beside himself and said to me, Doug, this is going on. I don't get it. And I used the person's first name and I said, what are you paying him for? And he was really straightforward. He said, I'm paying him to sell. I said, yeah, that's the only behavior that you're rewarding. What you've basically told the salesperson is the only thing that you think is really valuable is when she is out there making the cash register ring. Are you paying her to attend training? Nope. Are you paying her to coach other of your junior salespeople? Nope. Are you paying her to to help you smooth out any of your processes? Nope. You've told her, based on your compensation structure, that the only thing that you really consider valuable is when she's out closing sales. So why should she spend any of her time doing anything other than that? Because that's the only thing that you're compensating her for. And boy, he had never thought about it that way. So, kind of helping people think through where are other examples where something like that can be happening, um, can kind of get in the way of people thinking things through. And that's when I usually ask them to think about what's kind of the secondary and tertiary impacts if you do these kinds of things. And then finally, the last question in that segment: to what degree does our leadership team really have the appropriate attitudes and skills and knowledge to achieve our strategic plan? A lot of times, depending on whether we've done management or supervisory development activities prior to the strategic planning process or not, if we have not, oftentimes this question will say, well, we have some, but we don't have as much as we need to, and that kind of leads to an opportunity for some kind of a development process. Um, but the whole idea in mind of okay, we've gotten past the vision, we've gotten past the values. A lot of times I'll use this question to kind of loop all the way back to that. And when you really start to take a look at your management team throughout the organization, not just senior leadership, but all the way through it, to what degree do those attitudes are they really developed in a way that's consistent with your vision and values? And if not, what kinds of things are you going to start to pursue? So at this point, I'm going to ask Andy, Mike, and Tammy, what kind of thoughts or what kind of questions um, do you have for me?
So this is a little bit of a fringe on the rewards conversation,
Yep.
but have you ever gotten into different kinds of rewards for different kinds of people? And by that, I mean, some people would love to have a bonus. Some people might prefer time off. Some people might prefer a big piece of artwork in their office. Other people might prefer no public recognition at all, that kind of thing.
I typically use this to tie in either the values index or the driving forces kinds of stuff in terms of tying that together. Because a lot of times people think of rewards and recognition and they automatically think money or a trip. Um, so I typically will raise that. How do you know that an incentive for somebody is really an incentive? To your point, Mike, if somebody hates public recognition, having them come up in front of a room full of 500 people to get an award, God, they'd rather be any place on the planet except
Especially
doing
if they
that.
have to give a little 3 minute thank you.
Exactly, exactly. So using this, let's let's use this as a scalp, the way a surgeon uses a scalpel as opposed to a meat cleaver. To what degree does it have? Can we move away from the one size fits all, which is always simple to administer, but that
Right.
doesn't mean that simple is better.
And
Um,
that's the problem is it does take extra resources, either manager's time or some HR department or whatever's time to figure out who to reward with what. And then there's the other thing is there is a time transient factor to the rewards. If you give the same reward over and over and over again, it just wears out. It's like, you know, commercials change, right? You listen to
yep,
McDonald's commercial, and 6 months from now, it won't be the same.
right. If our colleague Dan Elliott was on the line, Dan would talk about he's tended over the course of time to move away from monetary rewards to either physical gifts, like almost like there's companies out there that provide catalogs where people can select, they get X amount of points or something like that, where they can select a gift that's important to them. And he uses the example that if somebody gets the equivalent of a smoker, as a gift, every time they go to throw meat on that smoker, it's reinforcing that that was a gift from the company in terms of appreciation for a job well done, as opposed to you give them that same amount of cash and it either
Yeah.
goes in the savings bank, or it pays the utility bill and there's not a lot of there's not a lot of longevity there. The other thing is, um, so in addition to kind of a physical gift versus money, um, the other piece that he talks about is if people have a tendency to attend some kind of an event because the event makes an emotional connection.
Hmm.
You know, whether it's a Broadway show, a trip to the art museum, or something along those lines, it cements, Dan believes that it cements it differently than, again, just, something
Money.
like a
Yeah.
kind of a check. That
Yeah.
it's,
So,
it,
so I'll reinforce that, Doug. I agree with the money part. And my experience is that money, whether it's a raise or whether it's a lump sum, is good for about 2 weeks, maybe a month at the most. And then people forget about it. It just gets washed into their normal baseline. The catalog thing, I've experienced that. It's very impersonal, because now all of a sudden you're not dealing, they say, hey, happy, 35 years, here's a catalog, pick something. And, and then the second thing is, usually the finance department was involved in that. And so they're cheaper gifts than the mainline stuff. You can go get like a lamp, but it's not a real nice lamp. You can get a TV, but it's last year's model, kind of a thing. And so, and then the third observation on that is that, events, not everybody likes them.
right.
You give me tickets to a ball game, and I'm just finding someone to give them away. I don't like ball games. It's too loud, it's too noisy, it's too confusing, it's too boisterous, and I can see the ball game much better on TV. You
Right.
don't have the emotion, I get it, but I'm not into it.
Yeah. Well, again, the events would have to be something that you want,
Yeah,
not the generic one size fits all.
right, right.
Um, that was once reinforced by Mike Slepin. His his daughter had an opportunity. They wanted to reward her, and so they invited her to have dinner with the company president. And she said to Mike, "Dad, why would I ever want to go out to dinner with somebody who's 40 years older than me, and I got to figure out how am I going to make conversation during the entire dinner?" She was dreading it. She was not looking at it as a positive at all. So, so kind of looking at it through the lens of the recipient versus the
Right.
lens of the giver, I think is something that really needs to be taken into consideration, or it takes a positive and turns it into a negative. Andy, do you want to give us your thoughts one way or the other?
Yeah, I've been through almost all of those scenarios. Company year-end Christmas parties where they're raffling off a trip or two, or and that's exciting, but not everybody gets rewarded equally. My last company paid bonuses, but only to a certain level, and the lower levels, the guys in the trenches didn't get anything, which was also unfair. So, a level playing field, sort of a balanced scorecard for level of contribution versus level of reward is something a lot of companies don't even consider. Right. But I'm with you on the events, the catalogs. Those can leave you with a bad taste in your mouth. If it is last year's model TV, you're just going to say, "Oh wow, how cheap is that?" Right. Um, in your experience, I mean, how in tune are executives while you're coaching those negative aspects or those negative repercussions of improper reward systems?
Well, we can add Mike to this mix, but my answer is not very.
Same answer, Doug. Not very. And usually, if the company's big enough, the I'll say the local leadership, regardless of what level you're at, has almost no control. That's decided by the corporate HR and VP of finance, and maybe the VP of legal. Those are the three people that tend to make those decisions, and they're completely disconnected, completely impersonal, and I don't want to say completely clueless, but for the most part, their reward system is different than the general rank and file.
That's been my experience as well.
And it's hard, so the only thing you can really do is convince the local leadership, however you want to define that, to do something over and above what the company does. Because it's really hard. Once the company gets to be, say over 500 people or so, those tasks are delegated, in my mind, inappropriately, but they are delegated.
So just by having the short conversation that the three of us have just now, that's a great example of how all of a sudden it starts to elevate the discussion on something that they may want to consider doing things differently, or really getting to know their people differently, and kind of take things out of autopilot. Again, the whole benefit of this process is kind of asking people to think about what they're doing, and do it consciously, as opposed to just kind of going through the motions and doing it in autopilot.
Well, they wouldn't try to sell a customer something that the customer didn't want. So why are you selling your internal customers who are your people something that they may not want?
That's a
You
great.
don't have the voice of your employees, your voice of your customer. There's many different ways that I've seen it misapplied.
Yeah, well said, Andy. Well said. Welcome to the network, my friend.
Thank you.
You're gonna fit in fine.
I've been around the block too many times to mention.
Hey, Doug, just to confirm, I'm looking at the LMS version of the strategic plan, and it doesn't have page numbers that I can find.
Okay.
So I'm down here on like the limitations, and there's questions like, are our core processes working to achieve our strategy? Do we have the right structure?
Are you in 7.0?
Yeah.
And 7.1 is structure and function?
Let me verify that. I think, yeah. Yep. That's kind of where I am, yeah.
Oh.
It's hard to track because like I'm in this section, but I can't really see what the number is.
Got it.
I think that's where I am. It sounds like I don't know what I'm doing, but that's probably true. But
Mike, do you see something that says customer responsiveness analysis?
I clicked the wrong thing. Sorry, let me get back to where I was. I don't see that, Doug. I see. Are you done inside the SWOT analysis instructions?
No.
Okay, so
The I'm just backing up to see if I can find a.
I guess I'm up in section 3. Must be. It looks like I see a 3 here. Creating a competitive edge. And that ends up with the SWOT analysis. And
I think the SWOT analysis is beyond where I am now.
okay. So if I go,
SWOT analysis, I've got a 7.4 in the written material.
Yeah.
7.3 is the questions for SLOT.
Yeah. Okay. I'm with you now. I see it.
7.2
I see the questions. Yeah.
So above the last section in above 7.2, the last section within 7.1 is customer responsiveness. And now,
Yeah, I got it. I'm with you. Sorry. Yeah.
understood.
I think I'm there. Yeah.
So this table here is normally pretty straightforward. I don't usually have a lot of people that have a lot of questions about it, kind of ordering, billing, delivering, etc., what they perceive their level of responsiveness to be, and kind of improvement opportunity or action steps coming out of that, and the prioritization. That normally is a pretty straightforward conversation in terms of discussion with them. Um, have clear measurements for customer expectations been established? And if yes, how are they monitored? And if no, what will need to happen? The great majority of people have never thought about customer expectation measurements. Um, they'll immediately think about, oh, you're just talking about, discovery, kind of the sales side, is so as opposed to what's it going to be like for us to actually do business together from an
Yeah.
expectations perspective. So most of the time, there's a lot of kind of flopping around on the beach um, on this particular question. So it really tends to be more of a discussion about, well, how do you know how somebody really wants to do business with you? And a lot of times, personally, I'll end up talking about the difference between the golden rule. If they're not familiar with it, that's when I'll introduce the difference between the golden rule and the platinum rule, in terms of that. Andy, just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if you know the difference between golden rule and platinum rule.
I'm not familiar with the platinum rule.
So the golden rule is to treat others the way you want to be treated. The platinum rule is treat others the way they want to be treated.
Gotcha.
You know what pisses me off about that, Doug?
What's
Is
that?
I discovered the platinum rule and identified it about 10 years ago. And I didn't call it the platinum rule. And I said it to a large number of people, and they, oh, yeah, right, Mike. And all of a sudden, boom, it's the standard, right? Dang.
A man ahead of your time, Mike.
I bet you a nickel, though, that anybody who does what we're doing, and I discovered that before I started doing this, has figured that out. I mean, it's clearly not how I want to be treated. It's how you want to be treated.
As Tammy and I have been known to have a conversation, temporarily it's their money. Where does the responsibility lie for profitability? And the answer that we're looking for, kind of corporately from a trusted advisor's perspective, is in everybody. Because everybody contributes to profitability based on what they do or don't do. And so when people have a tendency to think about that as a top of the house is responsible for profitability, that tends to be really eye-opening in terms of the way they manage and how little they tend to really engage people throughout the organization. So that completes 7.1. 7.2, we start swinging into resources, and the first section is internal resources. And there's a within that section, it speaks. The first thing, just to make sure you know what I'm talking about here, looks like a table that looks something along those lines, where it talks about manufacturing and financial and facilities and so on. What specific resources, if any, are needed in the following areas to achieve your goals? That gets people to kind of open up the thought process a little bit. But one of the things that I found was really helpful on that question is asking a follow-up question in which of those resources are needed versus what resources are merely desirable. And I find that by kind of asking that level of distinction, it kind of moves it away from a wish list and kind of starts to frame it in terms of, okay, so what are those things that really do need to be put in place? And ultimately, that's going to lead to a discussion about okay, so how are we going to fund it, right? And so it starts to kind of sow that seed as something that's ultimately going to come downstream of that a little bit. Um, then we get into product and service. And the first question has had a lot of discussion around it, and that's, is our product or service offering adequate to meet the needs of the market? And on that question, the word adequate has really been fascinating, because some people will define adequate to mean sufficient, meaning that it meets the minimum standard to meet the needs of the market. Other people have a tendency to read the word adequate, and they have a tendency to think of closer to all-encompassing. You know, is our product and service all-encompassing enough to meet the needs of the market? So I would suggest that when you start to facilitate this question specifically, make sure that you know what people mean in terms of how they're defining the word adequate. It sounds like a basic question, but to me it really frames the discussion. The beauty of it is no matter how they answer it, you can introduce the other concept. So we have a lot of wiggle room in terms of where we take it. If they're thinking about it as all encompassing, you could say, well, how would you answer differently if you thought about kind of bare minimum? And if they've answered it from a minimalist perspective, think about, well, how would you answer this if you started to think of this as broader and started to think of it as all encompassing? So you can kind of get them thinking.
I got a comment on that, but doesn't that relate to also how you define the needs of the market? I mean, you can service the market at a bare minimum with bare minimum adequate resources, or you can strive to innovate and be a market buster with minimal resources, and you're likely going to fail. Or you can, if your strategic plan is to innovate and bust the market, then that takes a whole different level of adequacy to it. So don't you have to talk about both sides of that equation?
Yeah, and some of that has been done in some prior discussions. But Andy, to your point, if for whatever reason that surfaced before and didn't really get either resolved or adequately discussed, I would absolutely use this as an opportunity to circle back at this point and kind of put a bow on that discussion so that everybody's kind of thinking about it through the same lens. Absolutely.
Right.
So a lot of this comes to, though, Doug, is that, there's always one faction, usually in finance, that wants to constrain the resources, right? Because that's money, it's going to affect my profitability. And then there's another faction that wants to grow and needs the resources to grow to produce more resources. And that's a tough conversation for me, because, it's like you got these kind of guys at loggerheads almost. And ultimately, only the leader can sort that out. And then it has to make that, I'll say, delicate decision about how much can I afford to put in there. And it has a lot to do with their mentality.
It does. And that's why in our role as a facilitator of that process, part of it, quite candidly, is surfacing it so that they recognize that there's two different mindsets. And quite candidly, in a lot of when I'm working particularly on the for-profit side, a lot of times when somebody starts to talk about what they want to do from an annual revenue perspective, I'll ask them, what kind of average profitability do you want? Because if they want to grow fast and they don't care about making money, they can be a lot more opportunistic. That if their whole strategy going forward is going to be slow, controlled growth, where they take X amount of dollars and use that as seed capital, in terms of generating organic growth, that really does affect what strategies are on or off the table. And quite candidly, we don't ever have a dog in the hunt, our whole goal is to make sure that they know collectively how they're operating, so that we can try to minimize the internecine warfare going on, between sales that wants to go out and give everything away for the world, and finance that may not have ever seen a dollar that they didn't want to just go ahead and put in savings. Somewhere along the line, there's always going to be a push pull there. But if you have the team understanding what's that, in almost that, even though it's not really an investment strategy, I tend to think about it as kind of as an investment strategy, or allocation of resources. How do you want to allocate those resources so that it's going to allow you to do what you say you want to do? Ultimately, a lot of times I'll see this kind of playing out, that they'll have all kinds of wonderful plans, and I'll say, well, what kind of organizational structure, meaning boxes on an org chart, is it actually going to take to pull this off? And quite candidly, in the old days when people used to work out of an office, do you even have the physical footprint to be able to put people around desks and cubicles and and all this kind of stuff? Excuse me, to actually be able to do what you're saying you want to do. A lot of times they don't know. They answer things from kind of a cocktail party perspective, but they don't always think through what are the ramifications. If I'm really serious about this, what's the ramifications if I actually do what I tell you I'm going to do? A lot of times that's where I think we end up kind of, our function is almost holding a mirror up in front of somebody to make sure that they can actually see, what's really going on and what these things actually kind of lead to.
That's the delicate part, and a lot of the people I work with only want to think in one or two dimensions at a time, and you got to balance out a lot of things, right?
That's right.
That's something I've done in my past, and it was a steel mill in New Jersey, and we were implementing lean, which was process and people. In order to justify to the finance folks the improvements we were making, we put it in terms of productivity. So we produce so many tons of steel, we have so many man hours. How many man hours does it take to produce a ton of steel? And as we improved the process, we had less man hours per ton of steel, which did what? It opened up capacity. So we could then, and we were only working a first shift. So the old mentality was, well, we're only getting some X amount of man hours per ton. We need more man hours in order to increase tons. Or the flip side of that equation is, or you improve the process and get more throughput per man hour. And that really opened up the finance guys' eyes, because they always look at dollars produced per man hour. But when you look at the inverse, man hours per dollar produced, it's a totally different equation. And,
yeah.
and now that drives you into the process and say, okay, now what do I want to do? Do I want to make the process more efficient so I get more throughput and that opens capacity for potential additional sales? Or do I want to live status quo and just add more people, which is more cost per ton? So there's a couple different flip sides you can use with finance people to get their eyes opened up for A, defining the business strategy, and B, executing it into a process improvement. And that was really successful for that company.
Oh, I can absolutely believe that. But again, Andy, the beauty is what you're doing is you're making people think.
Yeah.
I mean, for as simple as it sounds.
Would you rather have 10 man hours per ton, or 15 man hours per ton, quicker, and then it comes back to what is your demand? You don't need it quicker. So you might as well reduce the man hours per ton. If you need it quicker, then maybe short term you're willing to pay for it until you can get that capacity issue leveled out. So I mean, I'm using manufacturing examples because that's where I'm most familiar, but it goes in an office setting or anywhere else, right?
Well, yeah, me too. I'm an old manufacturing guy myself, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
One of the things, since you said this, one of the things I want to reinforce, because I reinforce it with clients all the time, the beauty of what we're going through here is strategic planning is a thought process. The deliverable in terms of the plan is almost secondary. You know, the fact that people are going to get the equivalent of a book to put on their shelf, to me, I could care less about whether a book ever gets produced. It's really having a vehicle to be able to think through these questions and align on it as a management team. And that's what I find is so lacking in so many organizations.
Yeah, and once the mindset has changed, the execution is very simple.
That's right. Right? That to me is really where it's all about. It's all about having to, it's, what's that old expression? A mind once stretched never goes back to its original dimensions.
Right, right.
Right? So once we start asking these questions and they start questioning, well, why do we do what we do? All of a sudden, now the game has just changed.
Yeah.
And you know, even if they decide that they're not going to do anything differently,
And it gives
that's
you
okay. But I know that they've done it consciously.
But it gives you a competitive advantage because you're thinking about an operation or a business differently than your competition, and that changes the game.
Andy, did I tell you I like you?
Thank you. Like I said, I've been around the block too many times not to, understand multitude of these issues.
Yeah. Well, I think I look forward to seeing great things from you.
Thank you.
So now we get into the, are there new product or service opportunities we should pursue? And Andy, to your point, this really kind of comes out from based on a lot of other discussions that have taken place. What are the needs of the market? What kinds of things, what would we need to invest in, in order to be able to do that? What's our tolerance for risk? I mean, there's a lot of different things that kind of enter into that. Moving into the three questions of support, do we have adequate resources in place to support our marketing and sales effort, and what are they? Do we have adequate resources to support our customer and customer support or service needs and functions? And based on the vision, again, kind of going out on more of a North Star or timeless, what additional resources are really required? And just make sure that we kind of capture that as a placeholder. This next section, organizational communication analysis, has really been fascinating to kind of watch this morph over the last years. And this is basically taking, how do you assess the level and quality of communication between different silos in the organization? So marketing versus sales and sales versus marketing vis-a-vis manufacturing and so on, marketing versus customer service, sales to customer service, marketing to finance, marketing to R&D, manufacturing to R&D. And a lot of times people never think about these kinds of things from looking at it to both from a process perspective and a quantity perspective. How good are we doing what we say we're going to, that we do when it comes to communication? Whether it's timely, whether it's accurate, whether it's efficient. I mean, all of those things lead to some fascinating discussions. And some people say, well, geez, it's interesting. R&D and manufacturing, they don't talk at all. So I guess our question to that is not applicable. And it's like, for us, it's like our head wants to explode. Say, guys, that's the problem, because right now nobody's thinking about what each other needs, and that's why everybody's just kind of going off in their own direction. So it kind of does lead to a lot of discussion. And in the materials, we've got a lot of spots where people can take it, where it says specific to us, what it really is, so that you can cross-pollinate whatever the various departments or functional areas that you have, and kind of complete this to almost do a kind of a full circle or a 360 look at what that communication piece is.
So speaking of the 360, Doug, it is kind of a loop. You can start with the initial sale and go all the way back to service, and it does make a loop. And this is kind of point to point, but there's many occasions, I'll say almost always, when you need, cross communication beyond the point to point. And if you think in terms of manufacturing of a tolerance buildup or a tolerance stack up, very often that point to point will result in the equivalent of a tolerance stack up. And so you need to short circuit that. Now, how do you do that? Sometimes through general meetings, sometimes by specific one-to-one meetings across the loop. And it's different for probably every company, every product. But
Mike, I suspect that you would agree with this. Can we agree that organizational culture has a huge impact in terms of what you just described as well?
right, absolutely.
You know, if it's one of those things that it's a very bureaucratic organization where you got to go all the way up and across and all the way down to solve a problem versus just picking up the phone or sending somebody a text message, this is where bureaucracy on steroids can sometimes really get in the way of things getting done, which also then speaks volumes about what kind of management behavior gets rewarded and which gets extinguished if they're trying to create fiefdoms. So, yeah, you can have all kinds of fun with this question in terms of when you start to unpack this question a little bit.
Yeah, I've not seen the research, but I'm pretty sure that the bureaucracy, the silos, come about from risk management, right? Something happened and somebody makes a rule and another rule and another rule, and pretty soon this is the way it's got to be. The truth of it is that it's like putting your money in a mattress, right? It's like, it's not really managing the risk, really.
Yeah.
You're just managing this accumulation of little bitty risk accommodations.
Never thought about it quite that way. Thank you. We get into section 7.3, and this is where we get into the SLOT analysis stuff. The first section of SLOT is kind of trying to do almost from a cultural perspective, how effective is our organization in seeking out and embracing change and then capitalizing on it. And that original thought came from Drucker, that an entrepreneur really seeks out and embraces change. It's one thing to react to it, it's another thing to seek it out. So how effective are we on that? How effective are we in both implementing change, and we have the word and managing change? A lot of times I'll split that question with management teams. And I'll ask them, how effective are you at implementing? And how effective are you at managing it? That's led to some very interesting discussions over the years. Is there a risk-taking environment which is supported by leadership? And this kind of speaks to some of the things that Mike's been talking about here in terms of people's philosophy about risk management has a tendency to not always be, you won't find it in writing very often, but it certainly colors how they're managing the organization on a week in, month out basis. What must we do to enhance an environment that will support change? This really starts to drive what actions are we really expecting to come out of this process. So managers are going to put themselves in a spot of discomfort to be able to, so to speak, break those eggs in order to create the omelet. Those then get captured in the SLOT analysis sheet or boxes, and something looking like that. And Andy, just for your benefit, we talk about SLOT as opposed to SWOT because a weakness may be a weakness, but a limitation does not necessarily have to be a weakness. If you and I we were equally good at something, but right. You had 500 people on your team to execute it, and I had 4.
Right.
We may be equally as strong, but you got capacity that I don't have, so it's going to be a limitation, but it's not necessarily going to be a weakness. And I find that when people have a tendency to think about it through that frame, they're a lot more open to kind of talking about, yeah, this is a real honest to God limitation. Where if I start to ask people, well, where are your weaknesses?
Right.
That's a lot more challenging conversation to have with people.
Yeah, it's the same as difference between a constraint and a roadblock. A roadblock means the bridge is out, you got to figure another way, but a constraint means sheep cross the road and you can get around it if you need.
Oh, I like that one. That's a keeper.
Hey guys, I have to go and get ready for a 1 o'clock. And besides, I got to do something about the construction in my house. So thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think this is a wonderful spot to break because this will pick it up on critical success factors that really warrant its own. That's not a 40-minute discussion.
Just emphasis for Andy, and I don't know if you've ever seen it, but when you combine opportunities and strengths, you get attacking strategies.
Yeah.
Which is not common in most slots or SWATs.
Right.
And same thing with defensive strategies, and same thing with internal development.
Right. Yeah, I get it.
Okay. All right. Bye all.
Cool. Bye-bye, Mike. Andy, knowing that your head has already been getting full of stuff today, this is probably as good as a spot to break.
Great. Like I said, I was in agility training earlier, and Wendy and I are working on my marketing plan, and I was talking about rising stars, and she said that you would be a good resource to discuss that with. So I don't know if you've got time now, or if I can schedule something with you later in the week or a month from now, but topic I want to discuss with you at some point.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you wouldn't mind, let's go ahead and put something on the calendar. I can give you more perspective on it in terms of some of the things that I've done. I haven't done as much with it recently as I've done in years past. So I may not be the most current resource, but I'm certainly willing to share with you what I know.
Hey, that's great. She sent me your contact information, so I'll send you an email and we can discuss a time.
I'll tell you what, pull up your calendar really quickly.